Hi everybody. In this video, we're going to take a look at Twinmotion's Path Tracer, what the settings are and what the results are. We're also going to take a look at Lumen. We'll look at the settings and we'll look at the output. I'm also going to close off with just a couple of thoughts on the utilization of Lumen technology within Twinmotion. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, everybody. So here is our quick test scene that we're going to use. This is the SketchUp scene with just some models downloaded from the warehouse. And if we pop over to Twinmotion, let's take a quick look. So I'm going to quit the media mode here. You can see we've applied some materials and we've also set up a lighting environment. And we're going to keep the same lighting environment really just going forward. So I move myself out of the way. You can see that when we click on image 1, which will be our default image, and I'm just going to scroll down here. You can see we're using a low sun HDRI lighting environment set to an intensity of 10 and rotated so light is coming through the windows. Now, in addition, we also have one area light outside. So the area light is just going to act as effectively just more ambient light. We do have shadows turned on for this. And we have a full attenuation. In other words, the light from that area light is going as far as it can actually go. And the intensity is set to 500 and the color is set to relatively neutral. The first thing we want to do is talk about the Path Tracer settings. And more specifically, before we get into the actual Path Tracer, let's look at the settings under Preferences. So let's do a Control-P on the keyboard and we can go to Quality. Now, these guys here are going to just determine the viewport quality. So I've set everything to high, but depending on your whatever kind of setup you have, you may want to work with these on ultra. But please note that when you're working with the Path Tracer, it doesn't really matter necessarily the viewport or how things look in that. You do want to just do a quick test render. Now, the other thing to note, depending on the monitor size that you're working with and your GPU, you may find that you may want to adjust the viewport resolution scaling. So I'll show you what that does. We put this down to 50 and put the Path Tracer down to 50 and click OK. What will actually happen is effectively Twinmotion is going to use upscaling, so it's going to effectively render the viewport at a lower resolution and upscale. Now, one problem with that is you do lose a lot of fidelity when you do that, but it will make your test renders much faster. Now, when you actually export from Twinmotion, it will render at the full resolution, but this can be really, really useful if, for example, you wanted to do a quick Path Tracer render at high settings. Now, effectively what you're going to do is be cutting down the time it takes for the Path Tracer to render that within the viewport. So it'll give you a good kind of overall impression of how your image is looking. Now, you can see here, if we go to Settings and we go to our Path Tracer, we actually have the ability to manually adjust the settings. So if we look at the documentation, that will actually give you basically the default values. So let's take a look at this here. Here we go. And you can see here now the default values for this. Samples per pixel and the bounce. By default, the low is 8 sample per pixels and then the bounces are 6. But if you want to speed up performance without actually sort of, getting the full quality, feel free to just drop these in half. So for example, we can go back and do 4 and 3 under low. And that's exactly what I have here. Samples per pixel is 4 and the bounces 3. Now this is obviously not going to look as good, but it will speed up the Path Tracer, especially before you decide to commit to any of those permanent changes. Okay, I'm going to put this back to low and let's just do a quick render in the viewport. So I'm going to do Control-P. I'm going to bring back our quality back to 100% on both the real-time and the Path Tracer. And now let's talk about what the actual settings in the Path Tracer do. Okay, so samples per pixel, basically how many effectively rays will be shot out per pixel in your image. Quite simply, this can be seen as the overall quality of the actual Path Tracer rendered results. Now, you can see that if we, for example, take this up a little bit higher, let's put this up to maybe 20 and leave a low number of bounces, you're going to get a higher fidelity and better looking image. It'll be sharper and the results will be a lot better. Now, it used to be that on the high settings, the old value, in some of the previous versions of Twinmotion, kind of about, I think, maybe 22 on, the samples per pixels for high was set at about 512. The default now seems to be about 250, which would imply some level of optimization of the path tracer. For end results, honestly, the 250 for a high render is going to be really, really fine. Okay, max bounces. This determines effectively how many times each ray done on a sample per pixel is actually going to bounce around the scene and pick up light information. You can see by putting max bounces to 1, the scene becomes pretty dark, and we're leaving our samples at 4 here for this. If we actually increase the max's bounces, try saying that very fast, you can see here it is going to have the net result of brightening up and lightening the scene. Now, this is going to be true only up to a certain point. In other words, max bounces is not going to overall massively increase the amount of light within the actual scene itself, but will effectively just determine how many times each ray bounces around the scene before it actually terminates. And you can see your max bounce is 3. This is the end result we've got. Let's go ahead and take this up to 10, which is the high setting. Now, you can see it does brighten the image a little bit, but overall isn't going to be a sort of light amplifier. However, in saying that, the high settings for the path tracer that Twinmotion comes with by default is going to be about over 250 rays and a max bounce of 10. Let's take a look at just a couple of different renders here that show the different settings. We have gone ahead and rendered out 5 images, and let's take a look at the end results, and we'll talk a little bit about the actual, basically the ray settings and the bounces, and see where the sort of sweet spot for an interior style render is. Now, this little guy here was image 1. This was the first render. This was done with a sample of 4 and just 3 bounces. So, pretty basic. Now, it's not actually terribly bad. And, you know, honestly, I think a few years ago, this would have been seen as really, really impressive from Twinmotion. It's definitely, even on the lowest possible settings, better than what you would get with the default Twinmotion raster style engine. And so I think, yeah, all in all, it's pretty passable for either just a quick test render. Even at 4K, it looks okay-ish. So image 2 here, medium low, this is my abridged version of the medium settings. So this is going to be 32 samples per pixel, as opposed to the default 64 that Twinmotion comes with by default. And so this is medium. We have 6 bounces as well, as opposed to the standard default, which has 8. And if I pop to the left here, you can see this is medium low, and then the left here is the default, which would be 64 samples and 8 bounces. And honestly, there is really no discernible difference except for the glass. This seems to be the only thing that comes in a little bit, better. The fidelity, it looks just a little bit better. Now, this is a very basic glass model that came from Twinmotion's own internal library, and it's just got glass material on it, nothing special about it. But honestly, other than that, other than really just, how kind of fine the glass looks, particularly these white reflections, on almost everything else, there's no discernible difference. The point being here, you can cut the default path tracer render settings in about half and still get pretty good results. Pretty happy with that overall. Now, the last 2 we want to look at are going to be the high and basically ultra settings. So this is going to be our render on really with about 150 samples per pixels, and I think at about 8 bounces. Maybe, actually no, I'm sorry, 10 bounces. Yeah, all in all, pretty happy with the look of this. And this one here to the right is going to be basically cranking everything up. I think this was the default path tracer high, so about 250, and I think at about 12 samples. Now, rather unsurprisingly, the ultra, the really high resolution one, took a little bit longer. It's not an even doubling of render time, but it is going to be a little bit longer. But overall, I don't really see a massive difference. I'm toggling between the two, and there's absolutely no discernible difference between basically doing 150 and about, between 8 and 10 bounces, or going up beyond that. Honestly, unless you had a huge amount of glass objects and a lot of maybe reflections going on, I think you can get away with cutting the default Path Tracer render settings in half and still get a pretty good result at 4K. Let's go ahead and just look at a few more settings that might matter to you. The next one we want to talk about is emissive and the denoiser. Quite simply, just leave the denoiser on. It's as simple as that. It's an integral part of the Path Tracer rendering. Just leave it on for still images. Now, emissive materials is just going to toggle whether actually materials that have an emissive material, usually the neon in Twinmotion, are actually going to render in the Path Tracer. Just leave it on. If you're putting emissive materials in your scene, you're probably just going to want them to act like emissive materials, which means you want them to cast light. So just leave that little fella on. Now, fireflies, I have this set to 0, but the default is about 30. I've never really adjusted this. You can honestly just leave the default at like 30. I haven't really seen much of a difference in this. So just leave it on its default. Now, the other one that I do want to mention is the anti-aliasing. So if you're coming from this from maybe an architecture background and not from a 3D-ish background, anti-aliasing might be a little bit confusing. So aliasing is basically just smoothing. It was very common back in the day with rasterized images where you'd see very obvious jaggies around the actual, for example, a sprite or something like that was on screen. So aliasing is basically going to smooth the image out. Now, generally speaking, what I have taught my students to do is to really just put this down. You will get a much sharper, better result by putting the aliasing down as low as possible, which I believe the default is about 1. I think that's as low as it will actually go. Effectively, aliasing is going to smooth the image, and so the higher the aliasing, the smoother the image looks, but also the more cartoony or CG looking as well. In fact, you kind of want that sharpness in the image, especially if you're trying to maybe recreate the look of some other renderings. For example, D5 render is particularly sharp in its output. And so if you're trying to get that look, drop that aliasing down to 1. It really won't affect the image except to make things look a little bit sharper. Okay, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and bounce into Lumen. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next part. All right, cheers. All right, everybody. In this part, we want to take a look at Lumen in Twinmotion 2023.2.1 and just take a look at the render output. Now, please note, we're using the Community Edition, which is going to limit our export render size to about 2K. But hopefully we'll still get some good work that we can compare and take a look at. Now, I'm going to move myself again out of the way over here. A lot has been said about Lumen, and if you're not sure what it is, Lumen is a real-time indirect lighting solution that has been around for about 2 years now, ever since, I believe, the Unreal Engine sort of jumped from 4 to 5. There was a pretty impressive tech demo that they released about 2 years ago. Now, since then, users have been sort of clamoring for Lumen to be a part of Twinmotion, because effectively Twinmotion is a pared down, if you will, version of the Unreal Engine. It runs on the Unreal Engine. Now, I should also point out a couple of things on this. Firstly, I did not actually think that this would happen. In fact, I was actually going to do a video at one point about saying, hey, Lumen is not going to be a part of Unreal, or not really a part of Twinmotion, and here's why. So, yeah. Turns out I was pretty wrong. It is a part of it. Now, the other thing is that people have been making quite a lot of clamor about Lumen on YouTube, but a lot of videos going things like, this changes everything, or this is a game changer. And so let's kind of look at this a little bit critically and see what the results we can get. By the way, spoiler though, yeah, Lumen is pretty incredible, not gonna lie. At its most simple, what Lumen is effectively, it's a single ray and single bounce path or ray tracing technology, which is kind of a mouthful. If you want a simpler parallel, it's very akin to how D5 render was in its early editions, which I suspect was single ray, single bounce global illumination. Now, D5 has kind of moved on a little bit from that now, especially in the more recent versions from about 2.3 or 2.4 on. But effectively, what Lumen is a version of that. Single ray, single bounce, better and more realistic depiction of materials and better lighting and better real-time shadows. You're going to pan around, you can see this already just looks incredible compared to the default Twinmotion sort of viewport, the standard global illumination model, the older model, which is, you know, very outdated at this point. And so when you turn Lumen on, it's just an automatic, incredible sort of improvement. Fidelity-wise, just the brilliance of the image is just way better. Shadows and specular lighting looks brilliant. A couple of things we want to be mindful of on the settings. The big one is going to be visualize mesh. Now, the magenta areas are going to be the ones that are too small to effectively be calculated by Lumen. And then the yellow ones are going to be Lumen surfaces that are maybe too large or too flat to actually be facilitated. In other words, they just won't be a part of the calculations. It, strictly speaking, isn't catastrophic, though, if you're seeing a lot of this. We can adjust this using the scene detail slider, so you can take it from the left to the right. Now, I'm not entirely sure that the description that pops up when you adjust this is accurate. I think it's actually the inverse. My understanding is 4 is going to increase scene detail and dropping it is going to lower it, but please, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on that. Anyway, visualize mesh conflicts. You know, for the most part, I recommend you can probably leave this at 1 or 2 is fine. View distance is going to determine the fall off for when Lumen just stops kind of working. But, you know, I mean, the view distance at its lowest is, you know, kind of 300 feet. Your scenes probably aren't going to be going beyond that. So don't worry too much about that. And the lighting update speed is just the speed at which basically Twinmotion will update or almost recalculate Lumen. And you can honestly leave that at its default 1. Shadows, I truly just don't love this in its current form. You can adjust kind of the shadow distance and kind of where shadows going to stop working. But honestly, you know, we're getting a lot of the light from our HDRI lighting environment and the big window plane that's outside. And so, you know, I kind of just turn these kind of down. Don't really need them or want them doing much in the scene. Now, one thing that will matter is this guy, the Lumen reflection settings. And so you can see here, let's take a look at this marble being reflected in this mirror. We've got 2 options, optimized and full. You can see that the optimized, the settings are going to be pretty low. It's basically quality of 1 and bounce of 2. But if we pop this up to Lumen high, so I've got a second scene here, you can see now this has got everything set to full, 10 quality, 8 bounces, and where you're really going to see that difference is going to be here in the reflections. So if we go back to the old version, you can kind of see there's a tangible gap here between these two. This is Lumen low, and look at those reflections on the back left. This is the reflection settings, and this is it on high. So low and high. Slight color change and much better quality in the reflections. There are a couple of things that I do want to mention though, and so let's go ahead and bounce into just some kind of critical thoughts really quickly. All right, everybody, just want to leave off with a couple of thoughts on Lumen and the state of Twinmotion in 2023 going into 24. The first is Lumen a game changer? And the answer is yes. I do actually agree with that assessment. It's not as dramatic as some people on YouTube have made out, but it is a big, big deal. Now, like I said at the start, I did not actually think that Lumen would ever be brought into Twinmotion, and I'm really delighted to be wrong. The main benefit is that it really does update the quality of what you're getting interactively within Twinmotion. Quite simply, the Twinmotion default interface, what you saw in the actual, like, you know, just when you're navigating around and what the sort of traditional renders were, the standard global illumination model, that just really doesn't cut it anymore. It just doesn't look good enough. And with Lumen, it really does. Stuff, scenes, environments, materials, textures, or everything just looks better. And there's no way to hide that. It is really, really impressive technology. Now, this begs the question, though, of how it compares to D5 Render, which again, as I mentioned, D5 Render's older form was in a basically single ray, single bounce. Now, does Lumen kind of outdo that? I don't think so, no. Quite simply, between the quality of the two, between D5 and Lumen and Twinmotion, D5 I think is still ultimately better. And it also is better on a price point. This is the first time in a number of years that Twinmotion has now basically increased its price and is no longer offering sort of free updates. If you're just joining the Twinmotion ecosystem, the cost is now about $750 US, which is quite substantial. D5 still comes in at about, I think, about $40 a month. And so you kind of wonder, is it worth it? And that's kind of a harder sell. The other thing that really benefits Lumen is the use of animation. The Path Tracer is by far the better rendering engine for still images, but Path Trace video is still just not really viable. It's incredibly resource hungry, and the end result tends to be really noisy just because of the denoiser effect. Videos from Lumen render really fast, and they look really, really good. And so, on that front, within Twinmotion as it currently stands, you're getting an incredible path-traced still image renders that are, to my mind, pretty much as good as what you're getting in offline renders at this point. And you're getting the ability to do better real-time work with Lumen and better video. The last thing I want to mention, though, is the hardware requirements. Lumen as it currently stands in its current version as of, January 15, 24, it is GPU and hardware intensive. Now, I saw on our basic test scene almost 100% GPU use on that stock 3070, which has got about 8 gigs of VRAM, which is not colossal at this point, but it is troublingly high, and that's just navigating, that's not when rendering, and so the hardware is going to be an issue, and there's just no way around that. You're going to have to get better hardware. Alright, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there for today. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching, really appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see some people in the comments. Cheers!